Okay, welcome everyone on an extremely cold and windy and unpleasant day. Good to see you here. We have a really interesting event today, and something which I hope will maybe start stimulating a slightly different conversation about the future of humanitarianism and humanitarian assistance. And the two speakers I have with me barely need introduction here in ODI, two extremely well-known figures in the field. On my right, the author of this report. Excuse me, I need some water as I get going.
We're all authors, both authors.
Both authors, but I noticed your name here on the preface. Excuse me. Simon Maxwell, former director, obviously, of ODI, and chair of the Global Advisory Council, excuse me, on humanitarian assistance. On my left, Dan Smith, Secretary General of International Alert, also a former director of the International Peace Research Institute in Oslo. You're both extremely welcome. It's very nice to see you both here. I had a read of this report, and it really is, it's labelled as a challenge paper, and Simon and Dan are going to speak to some of the ideas in it, and I think it really is indeed a challenge paper in many ways. I mean, if you look at the size, the scale of the humanitarian relief effort on an annual basis globally, it's somewhere in the region of sort of $9 billion US dollars, involving 200,000 aid workers around the world, addressing the needs of somewhere in the region of 50 million internally displaced peoples and something like 90 million people annually reliant on food aid. I mean, this is an enormous business, if nothing else. But it's also one in which there is, as you know, it courts much controversy. And there, I think some of that has been seen in the reactions to the international relief effort in Haiti around the earthquake very recently. And this report, I think, begins to ask some very serious questions and also to pose some very compelling recommendations about how the international humanitarian relief business can begin to change its underlying business model to be more relevant, more responsive, more effective in the future. Simon, are you going to go first? No. We're going to have presentations from both Simon and Dan. Unfortunately, we did have a discussant initially announced for this event, but unfortunately Paul couldn't eventually make it. But Simon and Dan will speak to the main ideas, and then we'll have a rounded discussion about those ideas. So Simon, why don't I pass over to you?
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming to this. I'm very aware of how much work there is in this territory, which is completely independent of the work that Dan and I have been involved in. Much of it at HPG, of course, in ODI, Randolph Kent's Humanitarian Futures Group, the work that's just been published from the Feinstein Center on humanitarian horizons, of course, the regular reviews that are done by ALNAP, based here in ODI, but not exactly of ODI, and their state of the humanitarian system. So we're relatively, I mean, we're very conscious of the little drop we're adding to the stalactite in this area. I'm going to quickly locate this work in what the World Economic Forum is doing, explain what our analysis has been so far and our main conclusions, and then hand over to Dan for a more detailed discussion of what we think we might do next. The World Economic Forum, as you know, is not just an annual gathering in Davos, but is a whole network of meetings and activities. Worth looking at their website to see what a broad range of things they cover. The head of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, decided 18 months or so ago to try and pull together a lot of the strands of thinking about the problems that the world faced and what might be done about them, as it happens, just at the time at which the global financial crisis hit at the end of 2008. The mechanism for doing this was to create a total of about 70 global agenda councils, which brought together 1,500 people from the academic world, from the NGOs, from the official agencies, active in everything, from design to the future of cities, to climate change, to fragile states, to transport systems, and in the case of the council that Dan and I have been involved in, the future of humanitarian assistance. And the original terms of reference for our group really covered actually quite a bit more than what we understand narrowly as being humanitarian assistance, because it really had a remit that covered global poverty as well. And so in the work we did, we had a lot more to think about than humanitarian assistance, but we eventually narrowed it down quite sharply. For people who think that the World Economic Forum is only a collection of business leaders, it's worth saying that the members of this council, apart from Dan and myself, included Gareth Evans, who at the time I think was president of the International Crisis Group, the heads of Oxfam, Barbara Stocking and CARE, Helene Gale, Sir John Holmes, who is the humanitarian coordinator of the UN, Angelo Neidinger, Director General of the ICRC, Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who ran the UN's work on fragile states, and a number of other people of that kind. So this was a very broad-based, multi-stakeholder initiative. And we met in Dubai at the end of 2008 and again at the end of last year with a number of activities along the way. So although this is not the only drop of water on the stalactite, it is not an insignificant drop because of the number of people who participate in it. I should have also mentioned Antonio Gutierrez, who runs UNHCR, as a member of our council. We had in the room, therefore, a group of people who know quite a lot about this subject, and I don't always count myself as being among them, but I learned a lot from working with that group, including Dan. We started out by trying to assess and to explain to the other 69 councils why humanitarianism matters, and to say something to them about the humanitarian imperative and about international humanitarian law. And the numbers that Alison mentioned at the beginning, some of them are in the report. This is a set of interlinked risk-related events which affects 200 million people each year. Of course, it's natural disasters and also conflict. And the caseload is rising. And we drew on the work of the Humanitarian Futures Group, who suggests that the caseload will go up by as much as 25% by 2015. It was important for us to say that in the past decade, a great deal of the humanitarian caseload has been driven by conflict, but the share is already declining and is likely to decline a little further because of climate change and population densities in risk areas. And it is not possible to stand up and talk about this subject without having a very recent disaster in one's mind. Of course, Haiti dominated the agenda in Davos. Just yesterday, we saw the heavy rains and the floods in Madeira, which killed, of course, a tiny fraction of the number killed in Haiti, but nevertheless were devastating for that particular place. Important observation, then, that these disasters don't just happen, of course, in the poorest countries. They happen everywhere. We formulated, and we see at a very different level of response. And when I spoke about this subject in Davos a couple of weeks ago, I was able to draw the contrast between Haiti at one extreme, I mean, a state where there was very high vulnerability, very high susceptibility to the earthquake when it happened, very poor government capacity to respond, and very few resources available to deal with the immediate crisis. And to contrast that with the earthquake in China a couple of years ago, where, of course, there was also a devastating number of people killed, but where the government capacity to respond was much higher, mobilise local resources, and a relatively small response by the international community. We might go to another kind of case where you look at earthquakes in Mexico, and we had quite a lot of conversation in Davos about places which have much stronger building codes and therefore much less susceptible to these crises. Imagine, therefore, different kinds of cases. Haiti at one extreme, as I say, highly fragile, highly vulnerable, very badly affected, highly dependent on outside resources. China at the other extreme, with much stronger capacity to respond. Pakistan somewhere in the middle. When the earthquake took place, it was overwhelming for local capacity, but there was a strong response by the government and by the military in Pakistan, supported by the international community. How do we move countries from the Haiti column to the China column, passing through Pakistan in the way, is the kind of way we thought about this problem when we started discussing it. Now, the World Economic Forum has a track record on humanitarian aid. focusing particularly on the comparative advantage that you would expect from that organisation, which is to bring business into the conversation. And there are 2 or 3 things on this PowerPoint that I would just like to highlight. Starting over here on the left, with the humanitarian relief initiative of the World Economic Forum, which is about creating business partnerships. And one of the things that happens in an organisation like that is that when there's a crisis, businesses ring up and say, what can we do? Can we offer drugs? Can we send some logistics experts? Can we help with telecommunications? What can we do about reconstruction? And for some time, there's been a kind of broker facility available at the forum for these cases. The work then moved into producing a set of guiding principles for public-private collaboration for humanitarian action. And the reason those are necessary is that it's very easy for businesses to become extremely agile and very responsive to particular emergencies, the tsunami, of course, Haiti, and so on. But they need to think about humanitarian law, about the principles of neutrality and impartiality, about making sure that assistance is provided not just to the obvious and easy to reach emergencies, but also to the difficult ones, that if we can have help in the Congo as well as in Haiti, that would be good. And so working with OCHA, the World Economic Forum produced these guiding principles for public-private collaboration in humanitarian action. And out of that have come some very specific initiatives. The most successful is probably the logistics emergency teams, which is TNT, UPS and Agility, working together to try and provide much stronger logistics packages for emergencies, running the airport, I think, in Port-au-Prince, for example, or helping the US military anyway, and trying to manage the enormous throughput of resources that are associated with these large-scale emergencies. A whole series of disaster resource partnerships, which are, again, bringing companies together. Computer suppliers and software people, telecommunications people. A lot of architects. There's a big construction sector group working on emergencies, how to reduce vulnerability to earthquakes. And all this happens before we start our work in 2008. And so when we started, we looked at all this, we looked at the range of material available, and we asked ourselves, what could we contribute to the debate? And what we contributed was essentially to produce a proposal for a new 6-step plan for trying to move countries from the Haiti column to the China column. And as Alison has said, these are really about focusing much more on disaster prevention and preparedness rather than relief, so that we have the structures in place. What a very unstable computer we now have. This didn't happen in my day. And so how do we approach this problem? Well, first we need to have a much better understanding of what the risks are. Geography by geography, class by class, if you like, gender by gender. I mean, to understand what kinds of risks countries face. Interestingly enough, one of the other 70 councils deals with global risks and systemic risks. And we produced a short, readable, and of course necessarily rather superficial challenge paper. They went the whole hog and produced a book. And if we'd thought of this, we'd have done a book as well, but we didn't think of it, damn it. Howard Kunreuter and Michael Usim, based at the Wharton School in Chicago, learning from catastrophes, strategies for reaction and response, a very kind of detailed and systematic analysis of risk, how we understand it, and how we deal with it. Entirely consistent with what we've been saying. And we took, as an example, actually the UK's risk register. I mean, it's actually interesting always, I think, to look at developed country experience when we're looking at development problems. The UK has a really sophisticated way of dealing with risk. There is a UK National Risk Register. There is actually a Risk Management Institute. There are risk management strategies rolled out right down to a local level in the UK. And that's typical in many developed countries. As in a typical risk analysis, you look at the relative likelihood of different risks, and you look at the relative impact, and the ones you really worry about are up here, which in the case of the UK on this analysis are the pandemic influenza, attacks on crowded places, and what does that say? Can't read it. Something to do with transport. a tax on transport. Thank you very much. And what you'll find in the UK is that right down to city level, people are identifying these risks, thinking about how to tackle them, and then putting in place the structures, the stocks, and the training they need in order to deal with them. So you'll see people going around practicing how to manage these things. One of the members of our team is Walter Fust, who used to run SwissAid and now runs Kofi Annan's Global Humanitarian Forum. But in a previous incarnation, Walter told us about being responsible for the Swiss disaster prevention and preparedness program, in which they had on a database the registration number of every vehicle in Switzerland, ready to deal with any of these kinds of risks that emerged very quickly. So it's all about organisation and building codes and preparedness. Why don't people get killed in such large numbers in Mexico as in Haiti? Because they have really strong building codes which determine the earthquake resistance capacity of the buildings. And we had on one of our panels in Davos a good account of that from a Mexican leader in that field. So building a comprehensive risk framework is right at the heart of this. And of course, this is also not a new idea. It comes out of the Hyogo framework, and there are disaster risk management workshops around the world all the time, but clearly either not done in Haiti or not implemented in Haiti in the way they should have been. Now, we know that preparing a plan on its own is not enough, so you have to do something about it, and you have to have the stocks and the plans and the procedures and the practice. And so the second of our 6 conclusions is we need to rebalance the spending between response, prevention and recovery. And it's interesting to watch DFID's activities in this area, where they now have committed to spending 10%, I think, of all disaster relief money on prevention and preparedness. Now, we think this needs to happen not just internationally, but also at national and local level, and to engage the private sector in a much more systematic way, including the local private sector, than is currently done through these various principles that I've described. And that's really where our future plans lie, and I will let Dan talk a little bit more about those. But they are about involving local chambers of commerce and Rotary societies and Lions clubs and so on, and not just relying on the big multinationals like TNT to come charging in and very effectively deliver their logistics expertise, but try to build a strong local capacity to do this. And the question we're really struggling with, which Dan will talk about, is how do we get them to do that? How do we generate the momentum behind that local engagement in preparedness? And then there are 2 other items on that list, linking the humanitarian to broader issues, because clearly it's the poorest countries and the poorest people and the most fragile in both cases that are most susceptible to disaster relief. And since many of the issues we're dealing with, particularly the political crises, but also the natural disasters like the tsunami, are blind to borders, we need to make sure that we have a strong regional capacity as well. Now, is this kind of model going to work, in Somalia? Probably not. But is there real capacity to build a stronger disaster preparedness and response capability in poor countries? We absolutely think there is. Is there a capacity to engage businesses in that in order to leverage their skills and their resources, their financial resources and their physical resources? We think there is. And the question we're really struggling with now is how to make that happen. And we think we have the answer to that problem, and I'll hand over to Dan to conjure it out of a hat.